on image enhancement, that is quantum machine learning based or quantum machine learning inspired image enhancement, have the very basic knowledge of quantum machine learning from this topic, and they will be able to apply the same in image enhancement or maybe in other particular research area. So with this, I welcome you again, sir, and I take this session, hand over the session to you, sir, please.
Thank you, sir. So, um, so I'm assuming that the audience here are, some of them are new to machine learning. So we'll have a quick discussion on the introduction of machine learning and why do we need quantum machine learning. I will share the experience from a real world project, and we will use the same, project example later in quantum machine learning also. So, what is machine learning and why is it needed? So let's say let's consider a bank, right? Very standard example. We'll consider that we are a large bank in India and we have tens and thousands of fund transfers every day. So obviously there is always a possibility that some of them are frauds done by the fraudsters, or they are tricking the genuine customer to perform a unwanted fraud transfer. What really happens is that when there is a transaction happening, we assume that there is a lot of data which is getting captured related to the customer, to the transaction, and the beneficiary. So there is good amount of information which is captured, and let's assume that it's about 250 odd fields which is getting captured. Now, the problem here is that it's just a lot of data, and every day, if you look at let's say even 10,000 fund transfers, and assume that there are 200 fields, so it's not pretty easy to look at all the data. At a single transaction, you can never figure out if that transaction is genuine or a fraud. So the first thing that you do is you apply some rules on every single transaction to check if it's genuine transaction, looks like a genuine transaction, and if it's looking okay, then the chances of genuine transaction is better. Now the step two is to search for patterns. Patterns are of two types. One is historical transaction of the person. So let's say the person always transfers between let's say 5,000 and 50,000 to his family. Suddenly there is a transaction which is happening to somebody, some new payee, and the transaction is happening for, let's say, 1 lakh. So obviously it'll send you an OTP to validate, and it will ask you that OTP to be entered, and once you enter, it will say, okay, it looks like you're a genuine transaction. But if you have to look at across various transactions by across customers, right, it's not very easy to search for patterns. It's not really easy to search for a pattern which is so generic in nature. A human cannot definitely determine this, because obviously you have a lot of information, and it's practically impossible to write a simple Java logic to sift for some pattern. So how do we achieve that? So the answer lies obviously in the machine learning. So people coming from statistical background, so they obviously understand, machine learning is fundamentally built upon statistical analysis and logical rules. So once you put them together, you have a nice machine learning. And machine learning obviously is also more than statistical analysis. It's also about improving itself. So we give a feedback to the machine, and it keeps learning. So that's why the machine learning terminology. And machines are much better at understanding the data, because obviously it runs statistical model, and statistical model is always accurate in the sense that it will give you a precise data points, and then beyond that, for every data point which is lying in the space of the data that you have, the training data that you have, you will always find certain variations, and these are specific numbers. So there is no arbitrary values that are being put. There are specific variations that are to a particular value. So this derived data is now processed by various algorithms. So when algorithms apply to this statistical analysis, and it will be able to identify the particular variation, which variation fits into the acceptable level and which doesn't. So basis the whole data is now the trained data is now a model. Now this model is now used as an inference based during the live transactions. So, how do we stop the fraud, or how do we flag it for review? So basically, when a machine learning is running behind in the background, you will obviously find there are certain outliers. So let's say I have set a confidence level or a deviation to, let's say, 5%. Okay. If something is beyond 5%, then obviously my I'm not confident enough with the transaction, so I ask them to pass through a OTP, and then the fund transfer is completed. Or probably if it's between 5 and 10%, I'm still not very sure if it is genuine transaction, and hence we flag it for review. What happens in the background is it's given to a bank branch or a particular central operations person who will review the transaction and who will probably call the customer to find out if the transaction is genuine. So these are various practices which are currently being applied in the banks, and going forward, definitely this is only going to improve. Any questions here, or should we move ahead? Okay. So when we are talking about machine learning, we have broadly four types of machine learnings. One is supervised machine learning, unsupervised, semi-supervised, and reinforcement. So supervised learning algorithms basically try to model the relationships and dependencies between the target prediction and the input features, so that we can predict the output values based on the input that we have. It will obviously pick a function that would closely fit the input, and the fitment is a fairly difficult task even for the computer, because there are many iterations that need to be done. And over the period of time, the computation complexity for fitment is significant here, and hence the training of an algorithm is essentially an offline activity, whereas an inference is a real-time activity. So in supervised, what we are expecting is that the data that we have is labeled, which means that it's a predictive model, and we require the labels in terms of, well, let's say I have 10,000 transactions, okay, in my database, and my out of that, let's say 5 of them have been fraud. Now, how does the machine understand if something is a fraud or not? It obviously needs a label which says that these 5 transactions have been identified earlier as fraud. Now, if you find a similar pattern, then you need to mark it as fraud or a potential fraud. So obviously that labeling is essential for supervised algorithm. Now, the supervised machine learning, it has various methods. So two categories of supervised machine learning are regression and classification. Regression, obviously, it's simple linear or polynomial regression, or a decision tree, or a random forest. These are fairly common, supervised algorithm. And when we talk about unsupervised algorithm, these basically are uh, let's say k-means clustering or an association rule and all. So basically these belong to the family of machine learning algorithms, which are used in a pattern detection. So you do not have a defined target variable. When you do not have a defined target variable, which means you do not have a definition as to these are my output buckets, then what you are only trying to do is you are trying to only cluster them. You are only trying to associate them. Okay. So in this particular case, these are descriptive modeling or pattern detection that we generally use as a loose terminology when we are talking. So pattern detection and descriptive modeling typically fall under unsupervised machine learning. And unsupervised machine learning, you do not have output category, and hence your input is the only data that the model operates, or rather the machine learning algorithm operates upon, and it creates a model. Now there are various techniques to mine for certain rules and detect the patterns, summarize them, but the data scientist role is much more accentuated here, because it's more of human understanding to the supervised unsupervised algorithm, where we need to train the model. In a supervised algorithm, since we know that what is earlier what was detected as a fraud or a genuine transaction, similar labeling is not available with your unsupervised algorithms, which means that a human needs to identify what is the confidence level, and the basis of the confidence level, they need to run lot more training tests, or a back test, as we may call, to better identify the groups. And once we know the groups, then and when we have finalized them, we obviously need to do a periodic review of the unsupervised algorithms, because you do not want to have an algorithm which is broadly classifying all the data. Let's say we'll come to a particular example in the next slide. So unsupervised, if I were to give you a very common examples, you have in a retail shop, if you go and do a shopping, they will basically categorize you internally. They'll not tell you, but internally they will categorize you as a particular type of a shopper. So they will say that let's say you typically buy for accessories. You do not shop for clothes as much as accessories. So you typically belong to an accessory person, and since you have a certain spending limits, so obviously you are a particular you are whether and you are an affluent or you are not so affluent. So those are some of the categories that they will internally maintain, and basis of that they will give you offers. So you'll only receive offers, but you'll not know on what basis you have been given those offers. The other type of unsupervised algorithm we can talk about is stock market, where a market basket is created, basket of, or even for that matter, if you think of superstores, departmental stores, where you have malls where you have vegetables bundled together in a basket, or probably you will have a mixed fruit kind of a thing. So how do they understand that this set of mixed dry fruits is something that will sell well? So let's say I put raisins, I put blueberries, and I put blackberries, and then I expect a certain set of buyers to buy. That is basis of certain data, and this data comes from the sales information, and the sales information essentially is a very broad training data, and out of which they filter only for the blueberries, they filter only for the berries, and they will invariably create a basket. And this basket, they will find out what is the commonality between this basket, and what is they will apply certain rules, and they'll figure out, this is my overall, let's say 2% of my buyers will definitely buy this what I can call a dry fruit mix basket that I create. They will definitely buy. So 2% to me is a good number. So obviously I go ahead and I create that particular product. So these are some of the applications of unsupervised algorithm. And in a supervised algorithm, you will find Bayesian logic. I mean, that's actually one of the earliest application of supervised algorithm, which resides in your spam filters. And I mean, Bayesian logic as a statistical model was implemented earlier, but nowadays, if you will find that the same Bayesian filters are now operating at a much better, what I can say, much better intelligence, because now the Bayesian logic is for foundation of a machine learning, and the machine learning is now driving your spam filters. Now the spam filters inherently are based on the Bayesian logic. If we are to talk about semi-supervised, which is much more common than pure supervised or pure unsupervised data, is because you will have some level of labeling, but you will not have labeling within the group. So you will have, let's say, data. You already know that you have labeled a particular set of transactions as fraud transactions, and certain set of transactions as genuine transactions, and certain set that you are not too very sure that when they will come back saying that this is a fraud or not a fraud. So that's an example of semi-supervised. It doesn't have enough labels for being called as a supervised algorithm, or it doesn't have so much of or complete lack of labels that you can call it an unsupervised algorithm. So in these, you definitely need a certain level of feedback to be able to get a valuable output. And labeling is usually very expensive here. Why it is expensive? Because every single transaction, if you have to mark them as the fraud or genuine transaction, then obviously you have to apply a person to actually call the customer and say, oh, did you do this transaction? Did you do this transaction? So that's not really feasible. So what we typically do is we only mark fraud transactions when they get reported as fraud. So that's why it usually falls more under the semi-supervised algorithm. Reinforcement, you will find in autonomous cars and all. So the goal of reinforcement algorithm is only to minimize the reward minimize the risk or maximize the reward. And yesterday we spoke about quantum annealing, where the global minima was one of the goals. And in the later slides, you will also see that reinforcement algorithms are actually much better fit for, and especially when you're talking of minimizing of a risk, you are talking about applying a quantum annealing. And that's why you will find one particular category of problems, NP-hard problems, are optimization problems. And these either have a cost function or a reward function, and they can be used for quantum annealing, quantum computing concepts. Reinforcement algorithm obviously uses environmental feedback in the sense that it will identify what are the if applying the minimal or the cost function or a reward function, and if it is a global minima or if it is a local minima, identifying that information is essential, and that feedback is automatically taken into consideration when the reinforcement algorithm model is being built. The classic example is Markov decision process. And you will find that this is applied especially in deep adversarial network, which is a very common application. And you later on you'll see that there is reinforcement is a very small subset. Today's most of the machine learning algorithms are semi-supervised or a supervised algorithm, or in some cases it is unsupervised. Majority of the industry applications are towards supervised or semi-supervised ones. Any questions here? Okay. So the best thing that we now have is we have 4 different categories of machine learning algorithms, and each of them can be further classified. And we have real world examples in front of us. Continuous target variable under supervised algorithm is typically you apply a regression method, and the classic example is housing price. So if you want to identify, let's say, Cars 24, today you must have seen our housing.com. So when you want to sell a property out here or a vehicle out here, you give a certain set of inputs, and the inputs that you give doesn't really go through rules. Not just rules, it also goes through the machine learning. So what essentially it does is, basis of let's say you want to sell your apartment. Now the apartment you have is let's say 1,000 square feet apartment, and it's a 2 BHK. So what you do is you put the square feet, you put the number of rooms, you put certain amenities, and the moment you put all this, you have, let's say, about 30, 40 odd variables on which you are adding the information. Some of the information you do not add, you simply skip. The beauty of machine learning is that even if some of the variables doesn't have value, it will try to fill those values, and it will try to predict the output variable. But the output variable is basically a continuous variable. So your housing price or a car price is not a single or discrete values, in the sense that it's not a small set of values. It's rather a large range of values, and your target variable could fit into any of those variables. So housing price is a classic example for that. Cars24.com, you have a similar machine learning which is running behind. You look at medical imaging. Now, medical imaging, which is very prominent in US right now, but in India it's just picking up, where what you would do is you essentially take let's say a chest X-ray. And chest X-ray, you go, and obviously today a radiologist would have a look at it, give a report out of it, and then you take to your physician. Physician would have a look at it. They'll tell you if you're all right, or if there is some some pneumonia or something. So they will try to deduce basis of the human expertise. But this is a classification problem. If you look at it, you are either having a clear lung, or let's say your lung has got some impact, or your lung has got a lot of impact. So this classification can be done through machine learning or supervised machine learning, where obviously a team of radiologists and physicians would categorize during the training period. They would say, oh, this is this particular image means this is having let's say 20% impact, or let's say zero impact, or let's say this particular lung has got 80% impact. So this particular training, you are essentially classifying. And it could also be, let's say, a continuous target variable. But if you look at it 0 to 100, it's not something where it's like continuously changing number. So usually they say the lung is good, the lung is okay, the lung is not so good, or something. So these are typically buckets in which you are classifying. So that's why medical imaging is a classical example of classification problem. So you have clear target categories to which you can bucket them. In an unsupervised, we talked about customer segmentation, about a retail, let's say a Shopper Stop doing this, right? So they will essentially bucket you into particular customer types, and and there is no clear target variable. There is no value that you have to assign to them. When you begin the training, you really do not know how many buckets I'm going to get, how many segments of customers I'm going to find in this data. You do not know what is the target variable. You do not know what to begin with. You just have that sales data in front of you, and you run a unsupervised algorithm on top of it. Similarly, with market basket analysis, we spoke about it, and association. So you start associating. Okay, so let's say if I am able to sell, let's say cherries, I might be as well be able to sell plums. Okay, so these are associations. So when you know that you have cherries are getting sold similar to plums, what you will do is you'll just go and place the plums beside the cherries. Or let's say in a stock market, you have that Reliance stock is going up primarily because of the industry benefits. Let's say the crude oil is coming down, so obviously let's say Reliance stocks are going up. You also know that the other oil refinery companies are also going to benefit out of this, and you're going to see an upward tick. So these are associations. So this industry segmentation or association is something that you can look at. Semi-supervised, it lies somewhere between supervised and unsupervised. So you will have a categorical target variable. You will not have a continuous or lack of target variable. You will have a categorical target variable. And classification and clustering are two different approaches. And clustering, I'll talk first. So today, when you are using Google Maps, it's actually using a clustering. So how does it perform clustering? it doesn't perform clustering at a global level, literally on a global level. It doesn't do that. So what it does is when you're doing a lane finding, it tries to identify the GPS coordinates of each of the Android device, which is pinging back the GPS location to the Google Maps server. And basis of that, it does clustering and sees, okay, so what is my how large is my cluster on a particular lane. Okay, and basis of that, it finds out that this particular lane is jammed, and hence I need to give more weightage to that, or less weightage depending on the algorithm that I have. And essentially it will compute what is your fastest way to reach the destination, or probably you should change your lane, and which lane is jammed and which lane is not jammed. So this is identified using clustering. The clustering obviously is done on the GPS locations, and GPS, how much ever data that you have. So basis of that, it will tell you. In classification, this is exactly what I had implemented in my previous organization. So we had done this text classification. So it was a particular problem where, let's say, this was a standard problem in the hotel industry, where you will have various portals. You must have seen, let's say you go to yatra.com, or you go to makemytrip.com, or you go to booking.com. Let's say you search for a particular hotel, okay, and you will find different room types. Now different room types in booking.com and in makemytrip.com or yatra.com, you'll find each of the same room being described in a different way. Let's say one would be telling you it as a deluxe room, one would be calling it as an executive room, okay, or some would be calling it as a standard room. I mean, the variations are so many that you would really not know what. I mean, am I seeing the same room, or am I seeing different room types out here? So we wanted to classify that. How do you classify them? You do it basis of the textual description and the amenity structured data and unstructured data. So basis of that, we had done a classification. Now, this particular classification problem is fairly complex, because your textual description doesn't really fit into your standard processing techniques. Your structured data is fairly easy. So let's say if I have let's say a certain set of amenities in each of the descriptions, then I would be able to classify them, saying that, oh, I have a bathtub in a room, so obviously this particular room is let's say an executive room, or let's say the bathtub is not there, so this is a standard room. I could possibly classify that. But what would you do with a textual description? So they will have a long description paragraph. So how do you do it? So we apply pre-processing and post-processing techniques. I'll come to that in a moment. So that's one problem where I handled a real world text classifier machine learning. We'll talk about the same problem in the later quantum machine learning also, where we would be applying the quantum techniques to it. Reinforcement, we have already spoken. Again, we have a categorical target variable, which is a classification problem, and a no target variable, which is more of a control problem. So your autonomous cars typically need to identify control, or rather identify what is the signal that needs to be sent to each controller. So to send signals to each controller, it should be processing a lot of information in the form of the sensor. Let's say lane changing. If it has to do lane changing, it has to identify if it's able to accelerate faster, and if the car in front of it is going slower. So then, and the nearby lane is empty. So then it should be able to initiate a lane changing procedure. So now, this does not happen as a rule mechanism. It's not like one set of rules. There are more probabilities, right? So there are more and more chances of suddenly the vehicle in front accelerating, or the vehicle in the next lane, which is looking to be empty, suddenly the vehicle stops in ahead. So how does it handle all this situation? So it does more of machine learning, where it tries to predict, should I do a lane change or should I not do a lane change. So these kind of decisioning are basis of the reinforcement. And as and when it starts moving and it sees that the traffic pattern changes, so then it obviously corrects itself. And this correction is also again through the what I called as a environmental feedback. Now, basis of this environmental feedback, the autonomous car keeps going ahead without any human intervention. Now, the human intervention is also taken as an input, in the sense that the human override is taken as a correction factor. So the correction factor will tell you that, okay, this is the parameter correction that I need to apply, and it will again apply. So these are reinforcement techniques to reinforce that, what is I have to minimize the cost or minimize the risk. So that's the whole idea of control based problems. Any questions here?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, tell me.
Sir, just trying to understand the types clearly. Suppose if I take a chess game played by a computer,
Right.
will it like fall under the category of reinforcement because it requires continuous optimization?
Yes,
Okay, sir.
it would. So there are two types of looking at a chess game. So you could typically say that it's a reinforcement. It's similar to a autonomous car, right? So where you
Yes.
have to maximize the reward, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you do not have one target variable. You have a goal. A goal in the sense you have a specific maximizing the reward to win that chess game, right? And the problem here is in chess, when you begin the game, you essentially have so many possibilities of beginning the game that the machine learning will not be able to compute so many probabilities, right? So that's why in a classical chess playing algorithm, you find that it applies certain level of heuristic algorithms in the beginning, because the target variables are so many that it will not be able to process all of them within a given span of time.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So that is exactly why it's a control based reinforcement algorithm.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. So we have spoken about all these different types and examples. So it's important that we understand how do we pick a particular algorithm. Okay. So if I were to solve a particular problem, I will first look at, my first question would be, do I have a target variable? Okay. If I have a target variable, then can I put it as is it a continuous target variable or is it a categorical target variable? And if I have that classification, then I will figure out, if do I have is it a cost function or is it like a reward function? Basically, am I looking at a reinforcement or am I looking at a non-reinforcement problem? Once I have that, then I need to figure out if I have enough labeling. If I have enough labeling, then I go for supervised. If I do not have enough labeling, but I do have some level of labeling, then I go for semi-supervised, or otherwise I have only unsupervised algorithm. And definitely you then go for a particular technique depending upon what is your how do you want to perform it. So whether you want to classify them, or you want to cluster them, or you want to run regression on it. So these are some of the things that you will be able to answer once you have the other answers. And once you have this, and this is a standard approach for whether you are solving the problem through classical computer or through a quantum computer. This is the first step that you will figure out what is the type of algorithm I'm going to choose. And again, if you were to look at even regression, right, regression has got at least 6 or 5 or 6 popular regression algorithms or logic. So simple or multiple linear regression, or you have a polynomial regression, or you have a decision tree or a random forest or a support vector. So these are some of the regression types that you already have, or algorithms that you have. And similarly in classifier, you have again some 6 to 7, and common ones are k nearest neighbor, which is KNN. KNN tree, if I have to mention, so KNN is actually applied to one of the popular industry products. So there is something called as Elasticsearch, which is I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Elasticsearch. So Elasticsearch is a very popular storage and retrieval tool, where it's not a database, but it's a NoSQL storage data store that you might call, and underlying it uses KNN tree. And KNN tree, essentially what you're doing is you are classifying, you are performing classification. So that's why Elasticsearch actually internally is more of a, is not exactly a machine learning, but it's more of a statistical model driven algorithm. It doesn't have a feedback, but if once it has a feedback, then I could call it as more of a machine learning algorithm. Support vector machine is again pretty common, and the plain vanilla SVM or a kernel SVM are two different approaches even within a support vector machine. And support vector machine, we are going to talk about it in a little detail. Again, you have decision tree, random forest classification, and all in classifier algorithms. So these are some of the ones. Clustering, you have the most common one is k-means clustering. Sometimes hierarchical clustering are used, but hierarchy based clustering is something that you use only if you have a defined relationship or a hierarchy between the data that you are looking at. Okay. So I spoke about the text classification problem. So what we had applied was we had used classifier and text classification that we had used, and we used SVM. Here, it's important here to understand that you will in the right hand side, if you see the a straight line which differentiates the red and the blue dots. Okay, the straight line is not exactly what you find in a real world. In a real world, what you see is the line below. So in line below, what you see is it's not one single line that is classifying my data. It's actually a series of equations that classify my data. Otherwise, I will not be having a single classification equation. Now, we already read about machine learning having identifying an input equation which will solve or rather which will fit into the training data that we have. Now I spoke about the pre-processing. Now what I had was, now let's say I am talking about a hotel room description. Now hotel room description, it says, so the room faces the lawn, and the room is on the second floor, or probably the room is it's a twin bed and or a king bed or a queen bed. So when I see these kind of words, right, sorry, I do not really know how they can be classified. But when I start training the data, right, I will be in a position to identify that information. But there's another problem with internet, right? People can make typing mistakes, and typing mistakes are fairly common. Even in booking.com, if you see, there are a lot of room bookings where the description would have spelling mistakes. So you do not know what is how to correct the spelling mistakes. So what you do is you do a pre-processing to clean the data. How do you do a pre-processing and cleaning of the data? We applied something called as Levenshtein distance. So when we started applying Levenshtein distance, we found that there are differences, right? Uh, sorry. The classical, mistake that typically, or we wouldn't call it a mistake, but a variation, right? There are certain words, American English and British English, that we adopted. So between these two English variations, you will find that letter Z is used instead of S. So let's say, I'm really sorry, one moment. Sorry. So how do you identify those variations? If you have to simply apply a classifier, right? So the classifier may perform poorly because inherently the words basis of which it is doing a classification, text classification, they themselves are having variation so much that it will not be able to fit them well. So what you do is you do this cleansing, and Levenshtein distance is a good example. It's a good algorithm to clean up those minor variations that arise due to British or American English. So color is a very common word. COLOR, COLOUR. So those kind of variations are immediately fixed by the Levenshtein distance. Once that is done, your SVM will give you a better outcome, because earlier, if you had two different spellings of COLOR and COLOUR, it will give a lower score. And if it gives a lower score, obviously your your clean segregation of data or classification of data cannot happen. And if you replace the basic SVM with improved algorithms, obviously like a kernel SVM, if you are to look at, so then they will obviously give you a better result. But not every time it will give you a better result, but in most of the cases it will, because it's a classification problem, and kernel SVM does very well with the classification problem. But there are also scenarios where if the data is too jumbled up, in the sense that there are too many variations for the same data. One room, let's say they are close enough, but three different descriptions are close enough, but each one of them is equidistant from the actual description. So if you were to look at that, then how will you arrive at an outcome? And kernel SVM doesn't really perform very well out there. Out there, the basic SVM will actually perform better. So those are some of the variations that you need to look at, but it's also implementation dependent as to how do you apply them. So you do take this approach of iterative the values, and you look at the confidence level, and if your confidence level is going beyond let's say 95%, then you can definitely use it. Between let's say 90 and 95%, it's a best judgment kind of a thing that you do. And whatever are the outliers, you will have to have a human intervene in that. So obviously I cannot share more details because the project is still going on in my previous organization, so I will not be able to share much more information than this. But definitely, if you have to calculate the distance of so that the Levenshtein distance itself, if you can apply to the SVM, so then you will identify that the description kind of gets a weightage or a deviation score. So the deviation score, depending on the deviation score and the fitment equation, you will be able to perform, and that is taken as a model. So once that model is established, we will be able to further do an inference. So a new hotel room you want to add, so then it will automatically identify if it fits into an existing description or if it's a new description. Any questions here? Okay. So that brings us to deep learning hierarchy. We spoke about one-step machine learning. So you apply the logic once, and basis of the output, you simply take the output and you start inferring the value. Now, if I were to look at some of the complicated problems, like if I have to do image classification, like medical imaging, Okay, medical imaging, I can do it using a single step. But in real life scenario, using a single step machine algorithm is not very accurate. So what you tend to do is, and if you have a very high resolution image, obviously then a single server would be processing for a long time, and it would consume all the resources. So what you can do is you can give it to something called as a neural network. Now, the neural network is like a human brain. It has many neurons, and essentially they have this input layer, the output layer, and there are hidden layers in between the input and the output layer. So, so essentially, what it does is it has a multiple layers of processing, which can be done in the same server, or it can be spread to different servers. So that is dependent on the implementation itself. But it gives rise to certain unique problem solving. So yeah, some of the popular types are convolution neural network, which is CNN, or a long short-term memory network. So this is actually a type of RNN, which is recurrent neural network. So recurrent neural network, long short-term memory. You can think of Google Translate as one of the best example for LSTM. They have implemented LSTM in the background. Uh, and you have generative adversarial networks, you have multi-layer perceptrons or self-organizing maps, or autoencoders. There are so many, and you can, at the moment, I have only covered on the screen, I have only shown supervised and unsupervised for with CNN, RNN, SOM, and autoencoders. But if you have to look in detail, then obviously you will have many more algorithms available. There are more than 12 different types of deep a neural network or a deep learning that you may call. This is not a new concept. I mean, the whole neural network concept was pretty much in the 1980s. It was researched, and it kind of gave rise to a lot of what we call as the first intelligent set of machines. And Deep Blue, if you remember the chess game, the chess game and all, those are, if you think back, it's like more than 20-year-old machine. And so this whole deep learning and artificial neural networks and the RNN autoencoders and all is not very new. So they have been around for a while, and there are good number of libraries available, and predominantly you'll find everything in Python. So you will have easy to understand code. Uh, So if I were to look at some of the key things, so CNN, what it does is CNN usually is used for image processing and object detection. And they had earlier called it as LANET, but eventually it got the name of CNN. And earlier the applications was in to recognize, on OCR. So OCR was one of the first applications for CNN. Later on, if you see, there is this application of in the toll booth, right? So your vehicle goes, it reads a number plate, which is extensively used in West and in US, Europe, and all. You will find that used extensively, whereas in India the usage is very minimal. So where the number plate is automatically determined by using the image. So this earlier used to be applied using CNN. Today, a simple single node machine itself is able to accurately determine that. But earlier that was not the case. So earlier they used to use the CNN. So CNN typically has a layer to auto pick which image features to process, and it has a rectified linear unit, so that performs the operation on each of the elements, and the output is a rectified feature map. This is then fed into the pooling layer, and what the pooling layer would do is it do the downsampling to make sure that it is able to reduce the dimensions, in the sense that it's able to keep only the data which is needed, and rest of the data is discarded. So the 2D array, it eventually gets a 2D array because it's either a 1 or a 0 kind of map. And when you have a 1-0 map, then a 2D map, then it's much easier to process. Once this is flattened, this is you have a 2D array, and you have a linear vector applied to it. So you will be able to classify them. How will you be able to classify them? It's in the output layer there is a simple matrix operation which does the classification, and basis of that the weightage is assigned, the weightage which then is given to the output, and the classification is given as an output. Sorry, the weightage is used to compute the classification. Any questions here? Because we are now going to look at auto encoders and other neural networks. Okay, so autoencoders are typically feed forward neural network input in which the input and output are exactly the same. So it doesn't change, or it tries to retain the input as is at the output. So now what it does is it basically has got an encoder, a decoder, and in middle there is a coding function. So what the coding function will do is it will basically extract the information from and they will transform it into a different representation. So what it does is it tries to best fit or best guess the input representation, and internally once it has the representation, it will try to reconstruct the original input as accurately as possible. So there is definitely the coding function will try to bring out the outcome as close to the input as possible, which is not obviously the cases. Now you might want to think as to why do we need this why do we need an autoencoder is usually used in image processing and restoration of old images. So if you have a very old picture, how do you restore that picture? So what it will do is it will try to extract the features. It will try to identify let's say the eyes of a person. Okay, the moment it finds an eye, but it also sees that some of the original picture has got certain blemishes. So what it will try to do is it will internally in the codifying layer, what it does is it will codify this particular pattern or this particular subset of the image as an eye. And once it does, what it will try to do is it will try to fit the feature of an eye and give it back. Now essentially when it does a reconstruction of the eye, what it will do is it will know the input boundaries, and in this input boundary it will try to fit an eye, and once it fits an eye to it, then you are doing a reconstruction of the image. So some of the blemishes are automatically removed. So this is one of the practical uses of image processing, and which can be used in forensics, which can be used in you suddenly have an old portrait and you take it to the nearest camera shop, and they try to restore it. If they are using auto encoders to do this, they will be doing it much faster and in a much more natural looking picture, right? Popularity prediction is another, because what it will try to do is it will try to extract the code from it, and it will try to bring out the popularity, and then it will reconstruct the output, and then then do nothing about it. So these are some of the uses of autoencoders. Autoencoders, in fact, is one of the areas where the image processing is applied. And today, a lot of image processing, though it is done by GPUs and is usually used using a GPU grid, you can process even some of the largest image data. Sometimes quantum is applied in image processing. In some of the use cases, they are applied, but you would say that in a classical machine learning, in an autoencoder, the machine learning, quantum machine learning is not really very useful. It's usually very useful in other neural networks, but not so much in the autoencoder. One autoencoder, though, has got a very prominent relevance in quantum machine learning. One particular use case is pharmaceutical discovery. Now, what it does in pharmaceutical discovery process is that you have far too many variations in the input data. You cannot classify them so easily. So that is why autoencoders are used to automatically encode and restore it to the original state. So let's say I have a virus, okay, and for which I need to find a vaccine. So if I have to find the footprint of the virus, what I will do is I will essentially let the input be given, the input, what I can say, the DNA structure that can be given. Now what it will try to do is it will try to extract, and it will try to fix a certain part of it, and it will try to reconstruct and give the output. Now, if I were to manually do this to identify if a certain virus mutation, how closely does it match? So let's say I have two different closely related viruses, and if there is a mutation which I identified, and I do not know if it mutated from sample A or sample B. Now, to do it in a humanly possible way, it will take a long time. Whereas you give it to an autoencoder, what it will do is it will extract the fingerprint of the sample A and sample B, and it will know what is the sampling, right? Internally, it has a codifying function. The codifying function will be able to identify by itself. Now you give the mutated virus fingerprint to the autoencoder. Now what it will do is it will try to do the codification, and it will do a closely matching sample, and it will give you that output. So you will immediately know whether it matches sample A or sample B. So that is one of the areas where quantum machine learning can definitely be applied, and for in the autoencoder mechanism. Any particular questions here? Okay, so which brings us to a problem of a ResNet. I know this image is a little blurry, so I'm going to give a brief explanation about it. So you will see certain, green ones. The green ones are here. You will have the green ones here, the green ones here. Okay, the green ones here. So you will find all this green ones. So between these green ones you have a node. So each node does a particular processing. So it does a particular convolutional neural network processing, and there is a max pool which is being applied here. Okay, and at two different stages, the max pool is then given to further processing, which will give you a soft max output. So it will give you one max output, and these two max outputs are taken, and they are used for further processing. Now, if I were to simplify this, we will say that let's say you have the feed forward network with a single layer. It's sufficient to represent any function, but it needs to have so much of capacity. For any approximation, if I have to have that level of capacity, my single layer would be able to handle if it's beefy enough. But this may not be the case. Now this layer might become massive, and the network is then prone to overfitting the data. Overfitting is a very common problem in machine learning, because once you do an overfitting, any new data which is slightly having more deviation could immediately be rejected. Whereas in an ideal scenario, it could be within it should be within tolerance levels. It should be possibly classified, or it should be given a value which should be processable. But overfitting usually happens, and happens usually when your layer is massive, in the sense that you have a very large matrix, and this matrix would invariably be able to reduce any the input data. And when it starts reducing any input data, then obviously the outliers cannot be given enough deviation values, and that is something that we want to avoid. And this is a very common trend in the research community, that the network architecture needs to go deeper. So once you have a deep network, we have been building CNNs which gets deeper and deeper every year. But there is so much limit before you start getting performance bottlenecks. Why? Because deep networks are definitely hard to train, because they if you look at the gradient, right? So you have this problem of vanishing gradient. So once you have this gradient, you have so there is a processing gradient that you have, and if the gradient is back propagated to the earlier layers, right, the repeated processing will make the gradient smaller and smaller. And once it goes deeper, it becomes so saturated, and it degrades, that the gradient change, to identify the gradient change or limiting the gradient change itself, is a challenge, because it becomes too difficult, and classical neural network will start having an issue. You will not be able to control them. And that is where the ResNet came into picture. So they had this concept of identity shortcut connection, the SOMAX that I had shown, right? So it gives an interim value which can be processed further. So what it will do is, it will basically do a short circuiting of this. So it will skip this layer and this layer. It will give you directly, or probably all these layers, and give you an output. As in, you wanted the whole data to be processed, but imagine an image where, let's say I'm giving you an example, an image whose grayscale needs to be changed. Now in this particular grayscale, you need to remove the processing, and you need to get a black and white. Now after every layer, what will happen is, you will start losing the colors, and the features will start getting identified. But what will happen over a period of time is, even your good pixels that you want, you'll start losing those pixels. The pixels which actually defines the features of the photograph, you'll start losing that. And that is where the ResNet comes. What it will do is, after certain processing, it will throw an interim output, which will be taken for processing further, and rest of the layers are ignored. Similarly, the SOMAX 1, which is the second one, does the same. So all these can be taken together. Now, some of the features will definitely pass through all the layers, and they can still retain the gradient. And once that gradient is still retained, you still have a good amount of information to process, which is then combined with your SOMAX 1 and your Max 2 0, and eventually you get an output. So this is the idea of a ResNet. And if you see, there is a particular pattern to the task. Okay, the pattern to the task is that the CNN now needs to be trained in such a way, that the ResNet needs to be trained in such a way that it needs to have what we can call the adequate weightages. So at each layer, you need to find out an adequate weightage. And once you have a very large weightage, you will see that optimizing the weightage for each of them itself becomes an NP hard problem. Over a period of time, if you have, let's say, 10 nodes or 10 layers, right, it's easy. But if you start having 100,000, so then it becomes so difficult. And if you have to optimize those many variables, and using a single equation, if you have to optimize your weights, then it becomes an NP hard problem by itself. And that is one of the things that we solve in quantum computers. Okay. So some of the frameworks and libraries, this is important in the sense that we now need to identify the key ones. We also have to adapt to the quantum computing. So there are four different or common libraries which are available: TensorFlow, Keras, PyTorch, and Theano. And Theano, being the earliest of all the popular libraries, doesn't really support quantum machine learning. PyTorch, developed by Facebook, and usually the use case they have been using for is NLP, and it's fairly good for that. But PyTorch is not so very adaptable to quantum machine learning right now. Then Keras is more of a wrapper layer. So it kind of sits on top of the other three libraries, and it can perform very well. TensorFlow is actually the more what we can say is more adapted towards quantum machine learning, because they also have released TensorFlow Quantum. We spoke about it yesterday also. So we have this TensorFlow Quantum library which is available. So if we have to look at all this, we know that TensorFlow with Keras is a good combination for us to begin with. But if you have to use any of the other quantum computing capabilities other than Google Circ, then definitely you need to look at other libraries, and in conjunction with Keras and PyTorch, or Keras and TensorFlow. So those are some of the things that you can look at. So why is quantum machine learning needed? I mean, if my classical computer itself is able to solve so many problems, then why do I need quantum machine learning? So quantum machine learning, definitely, that there are optimization and there are decision problems, and these spaces have some of the NP-hard problems in itself, and not all of them can be efficiently solved by ML. So optimization, definitely ML can do fairly well, but when it comes to decisioning problems, then it becomes fairly difficult. So we needed a better approach to it. So in 2014, the quantum machine learning kind of became very popular because researchers like Skuld and Petrosian, they presented this paper, and that kind of brought a lot of attention to this. Prior to this, there was definitely certain level of research happening, but this particular paper was a turning point where a lot of attention came to quantum machine learning. And as we spoke earlier, right, in deep learning, the optimizing weights itself can become NP-hard problem, and that can really affect the quality of the deep learning in itself. The other thing why we need quantum machine learning is also security threat. So if you can relate to the cryptography problems, right? So the cryptography problems, you have a brute force approach to crack them, but brute force is doable only when your keys are weak. When you have weak cryptography, it can be easily broken using a GPU cluster or a single GPU, or even through a CPU. So that is feasible. So people have gone for stronger cryptography like AES 128 and AES 256. AES 256 is fairly robust, and AES 128 is also very good for for current technologies. But what about the future technologies like quantum computing? Because quantum computing can essentially have this inherent risk that you can harvest and attack. So let's say today I have an encrypted hard disk. It is encrypted using AES 128. Okay, I cannot immediately crack it. So what I do is I take the hard disk, and I know that there's a particular file which is available, and I know that this is the file I need to look at. I go to that file, but it is encrypted. And what I do is I take only a small set of data, and I try to decrypt it. I can keep doing decrypting for a long time. But if I have quantum computer at my disposal, I can do it in a single step. The single step might take a few seconds, and I will be able to have the data in front of me. And the moment I have that cracked key, I can simply provide that particular key to decrypt, and my whole hard disk is decrypted. So that's a real threat that we have in quantum computing. So how do we solve those kind of problems? So we have quantum solutions to them, and one of the quantum solutions is also to apply quantum machine learning to find out how quickly these threats are evolving, how quickly we can stop these threats, right? So that's one of the applications of quantum machine learning. So primarily you can look at it as into three different buckets of approaches. One is that your quantum computing itself can be made more accurate. That yesterday we spoke about Q-Control as a company which applies machine learning to the sensor data and the controllers, and it applies the outcome to the controllers. So that is quantum machine learning, because you are applying machine learning to quantum computers, and you are improving the efficiency of the quantum computers. So it's more of quantum computing and machine learning together. It's not machine learning with using quantum computers, but it is applying machine learning to quantum computers. So that's you can mitigate the decoherence, or you can accelerate the decoherence when you need. You can reduce the hardware noise. You can do all that stuff. The other aspect is machine learning efficiency. So what you do is some of the intensive machine learning computing. So if you have a classical artificial neuron, right? So it can process n dimensions. Okay, if you have a particular perceptron, a quantum perceptron, for the same data, it can process 2 raised to n dimensions. But when we are saying 2 raised to n dimensions, it's not exactly the same always, because obviously there are quantum errors. In an ideal scenario, it would have done 2 raised to n, but in a practical scenario, it would be less than 2 raised to n, but it would definitely be more than n dimensions. Now, with the same, classical hardware setup, you just add a quantum computing capability. You are inherently multiple times you are improving the performance of the whole machine learning algorithm. So your algorithm is now able to operate in more than n dimensions. So that's one of the advantage. And auxiliary approach, obviously, the industry tends to prefer auxiliary approach, where they do not rely on quantum computing alone. What they do is they mix your classical machine learning and quantum machine learning together and enrich the data of one another. And this is easy, because that's how industry prefers. I mean, they would be able to quickly make it modular, so that each one of the components can be replaced as and when you want. So that's an auxiliary approach, and you will find that the industry is always geared towards the auxiliary approach. So if I have to take an example of an auxiliary approach, let's say I have an image restoration that I have to do, a very complex satellite data image restoration that I have to do. So what I do is I give it to standard machine learning to do some activities, and in quantum I might give certain activities. So for example, if I have to detect certain radio frequency that gave rise to a particular image, so if I have to give it to that, so then I might be running it through a quantum machine learning. But to only restore the image in itself, I might be running a classical machine learning, and then I will be putting them together into a single image, and then I will be giving an outcome. So that's one of the applications of quantum machine learning. We spoke about applying quantum machine learning for kernel SVM. Sorry. So what is a kernel method? It typically it guarantees high accuracy, and what it does is it creates n by n gram matrix, and instead of processing a complete n square dimension. It would rather do an n by n operation. And when you do a reduce and you then perform this kernel method, then you are able to solve the problem. Whereas in n square, your machine learning becomes very, very slow, and that is exactly where quantum approaches can help here. So quantum SVM, if you have to look at, they require, there are some of the drawbacks though. So they require the matrices to be sparse or low ranked matrices, whereas a classical support vector machine doesn't require a sparse or a low ranked matrix. So those are some of the drawbacks that quantum machine learning has, because there are definitely certain approaches that we need to look at. One of the approaches to solve these kind of problems, and that is why the research is still evolving. Quantum machine learning is still in its infancy for that reason, because there are certain limitations in algorithms like QSVM. So there is a particular paper which says exponential error convergence, so which is proposed by Hayata Yamasaki and others. So what they have done is they have significantly improved the performance of quantum support vector machine. So if you look at and this is a fairly, I would say not too old, but not too recent either. So I think this was in 2018 or 19. I'm not too sure. So these kind of papers have actually improved or rather they have broadened the applicability of quantum machine learning. So the same support vector machine classification, if I were to implement in quantum, now my textual classification that I struggled with large variations earlier will now be able to processable within the quantum machine learning in a much faster way, and which used to take us like 1 week of continuous server operation for a small training data to be completed. The same thing we could have done it in a quantum machine learning in probably under a couple of hours. Preparation, input, error correction, and so on and so forth. So we could have done it and wrapped it up in an hour or two. So that's the speed up we are looking at, and we can significantly improve the performance, but definitely we have certain challenges. So if you have to look at some of the replacement, then you would wonder how I can replace quantum machine learning, or rather replace classical machine learning with a quantum machine learning. If you have in a classical space, if you have a neural network or a decision tree, then you have to look at the basic quantum models, algorithms directly, and you start doing so. Something like a Shor's algorithm. If I have to do that in a classical way, my classical computer will struggle a lot. So what I would typically do is I will apply a lot of supercomputers to it, a huge GPU cluster to it, and then run it. But if I were to do it in a quantum computer, and if I have enough qubits to do it, I might be able to do a simple operation. In a simple model, I'll be able to do. Similarly, neural networks, we can in fact map the whole neural network into a single layer, and if we are able to map to a single layer and we are giving that layer as a single quantum model, then we can simply solve it in a single step operation. Then clustering, support vector machine, and nearest neighbor, we already spoke how we did it. So the efficient replacement in a quantum computer would be to do classical distances. I simply assign distances, and I represent the distances in a matrix, and within the matrix I can then simply apply a quantum operation, and I will be able to get 1 or a 0 directly. And once I have a 1-0 matrix, I can immediately apply instant matrix algebra in a classical computer, and I can get an output, which is not feasible in a classical computer directly, because out there we resort to methods like clustering and support vector machine or k-means clustering. So those are the differences. And if I have to look at reinforcement, so this is a slightly interesting case. So what we have to do is in Bayesian theory or in hidden Markov models like reinforcement. So what I have to do is I have to essentially reformulate that whole thing in the quantum computing. It's not easy because I have to either for a reinforcement, if I have to do a risk minimization, I will directly go for a quantum annealing problem solving, or if I'm looking at maximizing a benefit like winning a chess game. So for that, I will have to take a completely different approach, and I can take either quantum annealing like a reverse way, or like to avoid a loss, or probably I have to reformulate it using gates, how to win. So these are some of the approaches that you will have to take, and this is a good ready reckoner to know if I have to move from a classical machine learning, if I have to move into a quantum machine learning, what is the first step that I do? So I have a clustering problem. I know that immediately I have to do classical, distance computation, but in a matrix way in a quantum computer. I don't have to. There is no quantum machine learning. I mean, as in, it's not a full multi-layered operation, but it's a single layer operation. For us, it's fairly easy in quantum computer. In a single layer itself, in a single step, we will be able to perform this operation. Any questions here? Because I'm just going to wrap this up. We do not have much beyond this. So if there are any questions, please shoot.
Sir?
Yeah, tell me.
Sir, are we having any logical cores within a quantum chip, sir?
You mean to say quantum machine learning, or you mean
no, the hardware itself, or in the when we are using the quantum chip, is it possible to define logical cores?
So logic, embedding the logic into the quantum chip?
Yes, sir.
Unfortunately, no, because quantum chips today in current state, they are not. So I know where you are coming from. You are coming from an FPGA background where you have a logical gates, and you define the LUTs, and you define the matrix for it, and internally it gives you a circuitry. I mean, it builds the whole chip logic and it gives to you. That's not the case in quantum computer, because we have not reached that stage. One, two, we are still looking at only at building gates. We are still not in a stage where we have built the whole chip or the whole what I can say, processing ecosystem within a chip. The chip only contains the gates or the qubits. In essence, they only contain the qubits. You define the gates, and then you are programming, and you are getting an output. I think the question that you are asking, the way I look at it as a general purpose, embedding the logic into the quantum chip itself, I think that's at least 15-20 years away. It's going to take a lot of time, because there are challenges in your material engineering. Because you are obviously you cannot go smaller than a particular size right now without starting to have interference between various particles, and that's a real problem right now. And also once you start minimizing, or rather even in a classical microprocessor, right, Intel and AMD are struggling to further miniature the wafer size, the chip size, only because then the temperature increases, and once the temperature increases, you have these runaway effects. And that's the same problem with the quantum chip. The moment you start bringing them closer, you will have electromagnetic interference, you will have thermal runaway, and once you have a thermal runaway, your whole chip shuts down. You will not have a clear decoherence upon which you can do a quantum computing.
Okay, sir. Sir, I have another curious question, not related to this.
Sure.
So, because of the development in the quantum computing,
right,
will there be any impact in the Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining kind of things? Sir?
Definitely. In fact, there are a lot of players who are trying to use that, but they do not have access to quantum hardware yet. The moment quantum hardware becomes easily possible, right, commercially available at a cheaper cost, people will definitely start using it, and it's only a matter of time before it gets in. And quantum computer will be phenomenally faster, and Bitcoin values will drop at that time, because your mining becomes much faster.
Okay, sir. So thank you, sir.
Welcome. Any other questions?
Dr. Karthik, I hope there is no further queries from the participants.
Yeah.
So I hope we can wrap it up here if you are finished.
Sure. Thanks,
Have you
everyone.
finished? Sir, I hope you are finished.
Yeah, I'm done with my slides. Yeah.
Okay, sir. So if there is no further queries from the participants, or even if they have, you can, I mean, communicate with us, or you can communicate with the expert directly also.
Yes.
He has also shared his previous lecture slide and today's slide also,
Yes.
and he has also shared his contact details, that is email ID. So all are requested to communicate with me or Karthik sir directly. Sir, once again, we heartily thank you so much for your valuable time, along with Dr. Aranjit Chaudhary. Aranjit sir, are you there?
No, looks like he dropped off.
Okay, so along with the speaker, distinguished speaker, I would like to thank Dr. Aranjit Chaudhary also, so to accept our invitation and to deliver this wonderful session. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again, and have a nice day.
Thank you, sir, and thanks everyone for being wonderful audience.
Thank you, sir.
So, dear participants, as we have also communicated uh, uh, yesterday, that you will be appearing, or you need to appear for the examination as per AICTE rules, and you need to submit the feedback